So as I as I take time during these strange and weird days, as I take time to reflect on all that's happening right now with us in the midst of dealing with this virus, I find that, actually during this time, I've learned quite a bit. I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned about my faith. For example, I've learned that I really do need interaction with others. That is something that's really important to me. I mean, I've loved the connections through Zoom and all the other things, but I really desire to be sitting across from someone and sharing stories and laughing and even touching. I find that I've learned that there's an awful lot in my life that I take for granted. Things that I never thought I took for granted, just things that I did that now I'm missing, and I realize that I really did take for granted, like going to the grocery store or something like that. I also have found that in terms of my faith, I've begun to find what really truly energizes my faith and what really drains my faith. And that's been something that's been very interesting to me. I knew that there were certain things that really energized my faith, but I wasn't always sure about those things that drained my faith, and I've begun to see some of those things. In fact, one of those things is something that I kind of wanted to talk about today, and it's not quite as a peppy or fun topic as perhaps some of these others have been, but I still think it's very important. Because you see, one of the things that I find is draining my faith right now is a sense of sadness that I have. It's sadness over the fact that as I look and see all that's going on in the world around us, and as I read the news reports, and as I look on Facebook and some of the other things, I realize just how deeply divided we are as a culture, and how deeply divided we sometimes are even among our friends. And that, quite frankly, makes me really sad. And I found myself wondering, is there anything that we can find unity on as a people and as a culture? Is there any way that we can find unity in something that can bring us together so that we can truly be the people that God has called us to be? Now, it's interesting because I found myself thinking about a story in Scripture, and it's kind of ironic, I think, this story and what I found in this passage of Scripture. And I've kind of alluded to this idea before in some other ones of these devotionals, but this particular story happens right at the beginning of chapter 3 of Mark's Gospel. Now, chapter 2 ends with this conflict that happens between Jesus and the Pharisees. I mean, they always seem to be in conflict, but this, right at the beginning of Mark's Gospel, is one of the first places where you see this great conflict going on. And the source of the conflict is that Jesus and his disciples were passing through a grain field, and the disciples had taken some of the heads of the grain, presumably to eat. And as the Pharisees watch this happening, they just get incensed. They just lose their minds. Because you see, they're doing this on the Sabbath. And according to the law, they were not supposed to harvest on the Sabbath. And so they get really angry. And it's interesting because Jesus approaches them in a way that I think for them kind of probably makes them even more angry. Because you see, the Pharisees were a people that really believed that they needed to have a resurgence of their kingdom. They wanted to see their kingdom come back to the golden age, and they were looking for another time of the days like the days of King David. And so as they pictured what it would be like to be restored as a people, that's what they pictured. And it was interesting because what Jesus does in the midst of this is he reminds them of a time when David and his soldiers were passing through a grain field, and they did exactly the same thing that Jesus and his disciples were doing. Well, that probably didn't go over really well for them, of course, but nonetheless, Jesus seems to find a way to poke them in such a way that maybe will help them look in the mirror, but no, they don't. And so perhaps maybe on the exact same day or maybe just later on in that day, they again find themselves in conflict. This time it's when they're in a synagogue. And this is what happens in this story. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had had a withered hand. They, that is, the Pharisees, watched him to see whether he would cure the man on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And Jesus said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then Jesus said to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. So Jesus looked around at them with anger. And then he looked at the man, and he was grieved because of the hardness of the hearts of these Pharisees. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man did, and his hand was restored. I think it's interesting that Jesus looks at these Pharisees with anger, and it grieved his heart. Because what Jesus saw was that these Pharisees, to them, it was more important for them to follow that particular law, to do what they believed was right according to the law, rather than even recognizing the need of this man. But here's the really ironic part in the story. Verse 6 says, "The Pharisees went out of the synagogue at that very moment, and immediately they conspired with the Herodians against Jesus on how to destroy him." Now here's what's interesting about that story is on a normal day, the Pharisees and the Herodians would have been enemies. They hated each other. You see, the Herodians were ones who felt like the best way for them to move forward as a culture was to appease the Romans and to get a reestablishment of the Herods as their rulers. The Pharisees thought that that was an absolute sellout, and they could not imagine anyone who would want to do something like that. Because, as I said, they believed that the way to restore was to have someone rise up like King David and overthrow the enemies. So these two enemies were united. They were united. Finally, they were united. But they were united for all the wrong reasons. They're united with hate of a man who didn't want to do anything other than to show compassion and love and show the very heart of God to someone like this man with a withered hand. You know, again, I look around and I find all these divisions and I see all these things that are going on in our lives, and I realize, boy, you know what? Perhaps now more than ever, we should find a way to unite ourselves around the words and the actions of Jesus. But instead of allowing ourselves to be united around the love and the compassion of God that is seen in Jesus, we are paying more attention to those voices that divide us and pull us away from each other. We have taken this disease and we have politicized it in such a way that we have come to express hate and anger in the very time that we should be expressing love and compassion. We miss the point so often. And just as Jesus looked at those Pharisees with anger, and just as it grieved his heart to see that they were being driven by their own political point of view rather than the compassion and love, so too I wonder sometimes if Jesus isn't grieving right now. We need to find a way to be unified. We need to find a way to come together. We cannot allow ourselves to be pulled apart in these two directions right now. Now more than ever, we need to listen to the compassionate heart of Jesus. Thank you.